Go ahead and get our introduction started here. So we are so happy to have you with us for our Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Annie Black. I am the Director of Programs and Volunteers here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. I just wanted to mention that we do have this series running every Tuesday afternoon this summer through August 10th, so we hope you'll join us for future sessions as well. Today, we're going to hear from Ron Schwarz, who is one of our second-generation survivor speakers, who will share his father, Charles Schwarz's story as a hidden child during the Holocaust in France and his ultimate escape to safety. Spoiler alert, he escapes to safety. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Jewish Family Service of Greater Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Refugee Services of Texas. As always, thank you so much for your support. It really makes all this programming possible. We so appreciate it. So Ron's going to share his father's story with you, and then we'll have time for questions at the end of the program. So at any point during the program, if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type out and submit your question, and we'll get as many answers as we can. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Ron Schwarz. Ron, when you're ready. Perfect. You know, Ron's just getting his PowerPoint shared here too. And Caroline, I think you're going to have to, next to the mute button, try switching the microphone input. I can't quite hear Ron just yet.
Okay.
Oh yeah, okay, you're good. You're good, Ron.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I have a story to tell you today. It's a true story. It's, as Annie told you, it's about my father, mainly about my father and what it was like for him growing up in Germany as a Jew during the war and how he survived the war. And there's also a bit about my grandparents who also survived, another spoiler alert, and what they did and kind of what their experience was. So for me, the story starts in Germany in a town called Ludwigshafen in 1925. Ludwigshafen is about 70 miles south of Frankfurt. And in the 20s, it's up and coming. It's a big industrial center. A lot of young people are moving there. Germany's starting to recover from World War I. There are jobs there. And there's a Jewish community of about 1,400 people. So not huge, but enough to have a synagogue. And if you look at this slide, the picture on the top left is the synagogue. These are actually pictures from the 1920s. That's the outside of the synagogue. And then the picture on the top right is the inside of the synagogue. My grandparents owned a watchmaker shop / jewelry store. This is the street where it was. If you look on the right side, you can see that clock against that building. That's where the store was. It was on the first floor. And the shop's on the first floor right under the clock. And then they lived on this same street. The name of the street is Prinz-Regentenstrasse. And they lived right across the street in an apartment. My father was born about a year later in the beginning of 1926. I think it was 8 days after my father was born, my grandmother's still in the hospital in the maternity ward. An ex-employee walks into the jewelry store to talk to my grandfather about coming back to work. And they came to an arrangement that he was going to start work the next week. And after this agreement, he takes out a gun. He shoots my grandfather in the chest, kills him. He fires some other shots, injuring 2 employees, and then turns the gun on himself and kills himself. This is what you're looking at here. This is actually the newspaper article from the newspaper in, I think it's January 11th or 12th, 1926. And it says, a terrible bloody act, 2 dead and 2 injured on Prinz-Regentenstrasse. I can't even imagine what this was like for my grandmother. She's 25 years old. She's still in the hospital. She's got an 8-day-old newborn son. And now she's got her husband of a year has just been murdered, and she's got a jewelry store to run. But life goes on. My grandmother, 3 years later, married a man named Oscar Schwarz. That's why I am a Schwarz. He adopted my father. He took over the jewelry store. And this, what you're looking at here, is actually an address book from the 1930s from Ludwigshafen. And you're looking at the section under Schwarz, and you can see where that red arrow is. There's Oscar, and there's the address. It's old German writing. It's a little bit hard for us to read, but you can make it out. Prinz-Regentenstrasse, number 65. But I'm not ready for that yet. Okay. So life is really sort of getting back to normal in Germany after the war. Really until it wasn't, and when in the late 1920s. So I want you to now listen to my father talk about some of the anti-Semitism that he experienced really early on in school.
In the, I don't know about the first year, but certainly in the second, third year, and beyond that, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the school. In other words, the kids called me Saujude, which is German for Jew pig. And I remember that the teacher really didn't take any action. I mean, he was not openly antagonistic towards me, but he certainly made no attempt whatsoever to curb the other children.
So that's my dad. Don't you think he's a cute little nugget? I know you think he has an accent. I want to tell you that I don't hear it. Never heard it growing up. I listen to that video. I don't hear any accent whatsoever. But I think what's important about what my father said is he's talking about this anti-Semitism. This is even before Hitler came to power. So even before that, there were these anti-Jewish feelings in Germany and feelings of anti-Semitism. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. He's named Chancellor of Germany. I think it's important to point out there was no military takeover. There was no coup. He came to power by completely legal and legitimate means. To understand Hitler's appeal, you have to understand a little bit what's happening economically in Germany in 1933. There's rampant unemployment, there's rampant inflation, prices are increasing in restaurants while you're sitting there eating the meal. A lot of it had to do with actually the Depression in the United States in 1929. The US had lent a lot of money to Germany to rebuild after World War I. And in 1929, when the US was in dire straits, they demanded repayment. Germany didn't have the money, so they just started printing money, and it just entered this endless cycle of rampant inflation and unemployment. Hitler said two things. He said he was going to give everybody a job, and he was going to do that by rebuilding the military infrastructure. And he also blamed the Jews. He said, the reason you don't have anything and you don't have a job is because they have it. And it was a really appealing message that resonated. About 2.5 years after Hitler comes to power, they pass the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were laws that really restricted the things that Jews were allowed to do in Germany. First of all, it took away their citizenship. So, like, even if you were born in Germany and raised in Germany, if you were Jewish, you were no longer German, you were stateless. So you didn't have a country anymore. It was then illegal for Jews to marry Germans. It was illegal for young German women to work in Jewish households. Jews, you can see there's a picture on the top left of the yellow star. You can't see here that it's yellow, but Jews that own businesses, they had to paint yellow stars on their shop front windows, identifying themselves as being Jewish. Jewish officers were expelled from the army. I mean, there was a whole list of restrictions on Jews from the Nuremberg Laws. And it really had a crippling effect on Jews in Germany, both socially and economically. But what you're looking at here is the front page of the New York Times from 1935. The reason I put that in here is I think it's really important to note that, this is in the New York Times. There's international knowledge that this is happening in Germany. People know this isn't something that's just sort of cloak and dagger and secret to Germany. So let's listen to my dad talk a little bit about the Nuremberg Laws and how they affected him.
In the meantime, additional decrees came out limiting the movement of Jews. For instance, I recall we couldn't go anymore to the park where we used to go because the benches in the park had signs, no Jews are allowed. It was difficult to travel because hotels had signs, no dogs and no Jews. As a side comment, after World War II, the Germans liked to go to the shore in Holland, and since the Dutch had suffered quite a bit under the German occupation, the hotels on the shore in Holland had signs, no dogs and no Germans.
You could kind of hear my father chuckle there. He loved telling me that story. He used to tell me that story as a kid. He really enjoyed that. I think it's important. My father started that little clip saying additional decrees were coming all the time. In all, the German government passed something like 400 laws and decrees restricting the lives of Jews in Germany. And that was just at the federal level. In addition to that, the municipalities passed their own laws and restrictions. So they just legislated the Jews into oblivion. So that was 1935. In 1938, things really come to a head in something called Kristallnacht at the beginning of November of 38. Kristallnacht, what happened was German civilians and paramilitary soldiers, they ransacked Jewish businesses at home. So they broke shop windows of Jewish businesses. They went into the stores, just completely destroyed them. They broke into Jewish homes and apartments. They broke down the doors. They broke the furniture, just completely trashed, the Jewish residential quarters. In addition, they burned down all the synagogues in Germany. And you can see the middle picture, that same synagogue that I showed you a few slides ago in Ludwigshafen. This is a picture taken after Kristallnacht, and you can kind of see the smoke coming out of the building. In addition to that, they arrested about 50,000 Jews. They sent them to Dachau concentration camp. My grandfather was one of the ones arrested. He spent about 7 weeks there before he was released. And my father's going to talk about Kristallnacht in a minute, but I wanted to show you on the top left, this is the front page of the Morning News from November 1938. hysterical Nazis wrecked thousands of Jewish shops, burned synagogues, and wild orgy of looting and terror. Again, there's international knowledge about what's happening in Germany, and I think it's really important to note that. So let's listen to my father talk about Kristallnacht.
We were spared. They never came to our apartment, nor did they destroy the store. And they told my parents later on that since we had a jewelry store and there was a lot of gold in there, that they considered that to be state property, and therefore it was not their intention of destroying it. They picked up my dad, and for several days we didn't really know where he had been sent to. My mother went to the Gestapo office every day to find out what the status was, and I gather they were civil to her, and she finally found out that he had been sent to Dachau.
So, like I said, this is the beginning of November 1938. He spent about 7 weeks in Dachau and then was released. You might be thinking, released from a concentration camp. Nobody got released from concentration camps. And that was true later, but in the late 30s, the concentration camps, they were not yet what they became during the war in 1942 and such. In the late 30s, they were more like prisons for political prisoners and undesirables. And so the conditions weren't great then either, but people did get released from them. Kristallnacht kind of confirmed for Jews that Germany was not safe for them anymore if they ever had any doubts. Parents were trying to get their children out, get them to safety. They wanted to get themselves out, but they wanted to save the children first. Arrangements were made for my father to leave Germany and go to Paris. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but first, my grandparents had to deal with a different situation. First of all, the Germans, one of the decrees, the laws that the Germans passed was a name change. So if you were a Jewish man in Germany, you had to add the name Israel to your name. So my father, my grandfather, who was Oscar Schwarz, his legal name was now Oscar Israel Schwarz, and women had to add the name Sarah to their name. So my grandmother, who was Therese Schwarz, was now Therese Sarah Schwarz. This document in the middle is my grandparents' marriage certificate. And you can see those notations on the right, the notation that's boxed in red. What the Nazis did, they went through those notations were added later in like 1939, 1938. The Germans went through the civil register, they pulled all the marriage certificates of Jews, and then they added those notations. And these notations say, this one on the right, you can see it's exploded, blown out on the far right. And I know it's hard to read that writing, but it says that Oscar Schwarz has now added the name Israel to his name, and he's known as Israel. So that happened across Germany. And why would they do that? Why would the Nazis do that? They did that, to identify people as Jewish. So if you say that your name is Israel or Sarah, everybody knows you're Jewish. And it also takes away your uniqueness as a person. It makes you just like everybody else. And that was part of kind of the humiliation process that the Nazis went through with the Jews. My grandfather gets out of Dachau, and 2 months later, on February 8th of 1939, at the very top left, gets this letter from the municipality in Ludwigshafen. You can see that it's addressed to Oscar Israel Schwarz at the top. And the subject line, which is blown out there, is about, it talks about elimination of Jews from German economic life. So Jews were not allowed anymore to, there were a lot of restrictions about what they couldn't do, but business-wise, they were not allowed to own retail stores. They were not allowed to engage in trade. And this was the letter from the municipality telling my grandfather, you have to get rid of the jewelry store, prepared, you know, we want you to prepare an inventory of everything that you have, and then it's going to be shut down. So my grandfather prepares, it's a 15-page inventory. It lists all the items that they have in the jewelry store. He signs it, Oscar Israel Schwarz. I can't imagine what that was like for him to sign it that way. I do have a copy of it. I'm not showing it here. And then the Nazis had their own appraiser come in to look at my grandfather's inventory. And you can see at the bottom left, that letterhead that says Richard Albrecht. He was the Nazi appraiser. And of course, he said he's not going to agree with the Jew. And he said, no, my grandfather's value of, I think it was 10,000 Reichsmarks isn't right. The real value is 6,500 Reichsmarks. And he signed the letter. Well, he signed his name and wrote Heil Hitler. And I want to tell you, I have been through literally thousands of pages of documents and archives in Europe. I have, you know, a couple of hundred pages that are relevant to my family, and nothing that I found resonated with me as much as seeing this Heil Hitler. It makes perfect sense he would write that. He was a Nazi, but it just took all of this stuff that happened and just really resonated with me and just really made it real. Anyway, my grandfather actually found a buyer for the store. They agreed on 7,500 Reichsmarks, which was somewhere in the middle. The Nazis approved the sale, but the purchase document, this is a paragraph on the bottom right from the purchase document, says the purchase price is to be paid immediately after approval and on the blocked account of the German State Bank in Ludwigshafen. A blocked account, what does that mean? It means this guy that bought the business paid the money. He paid the 7,500 Reichsmarks, but my grandfather never got the money. The Nazis took the money. And this was really very typical of what happened with businesses that were seized, you know, from the Jews by the Nazis. They had deals to sell them, but the Jews, they never got the money. I want you to get a sense of just how this situation is escalating in seriousness. Like, we started out listening to my father talk about name calling, right? He's being called Jew pig at school. And then they can't go to the park because no Jews are allowed. And then it escalates to physical violence and incarceration during Kristallnacht, and then to seizing of their assets. So, I mean, before the Nazis killed the Jews, they impoverished them. They took everything away from them. Meanwhile, so while my grandparents are going through this jewelry store, that's actually when my father leaves for Paris. And he, I'm going to let him talk about that, but he comes home from school one day and they tell him, tomorrow you're going to Paris. And we're going to play a clip of him talking about that. I just want you to keep in mind, he's 13 years old. He doesn't speak any French and he's going alone. His parents aren't going with him.
1939, I was taken to the railroad station, and with a group of 100, maybe 200 kids, we took the train for Paris. When we got to Paris, originally, we were sent to the Rothschild Hospital because apparently they had enough rooms and beds available to accommodate everybody, and there we were sorted out and sent to various children hostels. I was sent to a place called Chateau de la Guette, which was about 50 miles east of Paris. It was, I don't know whether it was owned by the Rothschilds or whether they had rented it, but we were 136 kids, all from Germany and Austria. We were very well taken care of there. In other words, we had nice accommodations. We were adequately fed.
So just imagine this, what this was like for him. I mean, again, going alone, he's 13, he doesn't speak the language. I mean, he must have been terrified. And none of that comes across as he's talking about this, but I mean, he had to be. And think about what this was like for his parents. I mean, imagine putting your 13-year-old kid on a train. You're worried about him and what his experience is going to be, and if he's going to survive, and they don't know if they're going to get out and what's going to happen to them if they're ever going to see him again. So I just can't imagine what this experience was like for the family. So like he said, he goes to Chateau de la Guette. The picture on the top right and the bottom left, the red circle, that's my dad at 13, 14 years old. Looks a little different than he does now in the videos. The picture on the bottom right is actually from a reunion of the La Guette kids, I think 50 years later in 1989. Most of them survived, 10 didn't. 10 actually ended up being deported to Auschwitz, but most of them survived, and they did have a reunion. And the top left is a class schedule for La Guette. My father, they were in school all day. And you can see down at the bottom where it talks about activité en plein air, that's outdoor play. And then under that, couture, ménage, that's sewing and housework. Why would they teach those things in school? They're getting these kids ready. They're teaching them survival skills, and they're getting them ready because they don't know what's coming down the pike. So my father, he spent some time at La Guette. La Guette fills up. They sent him to another boarding school outside of Paris, where he was. And then in May of 1940, a little more than a year later, Germany invades France. And when Germany invaded France, they marched into Paris, and people wanted to get out of Paris, right? Nobody wanted to live under the occupation of the Germans. When Germany first invaded France, they did not occupy the entire country. And if you look at that map on the top right, that's a map of France, and you can see that white line, that's the demarcation line. And everything south of that line was unoccupied France. Germans did not occupy that. And everything sort of north and west was occupied by the Germans. My father's in this boarding school at this point. The director of the school didn't think it was safe to be in Paris anymore, so he evacuated the school. He had a farm or a ranch or a compound in a town called Poitiers. So they took the kids to Poitiers. They didn't stay there very long because Poitiers was still in the occupied area of France, and the director decided that it really wasn't any safer than Paris. So they spent some time there and then went back to Paris. But I want you to listen to my father talk about the train ride from Paris to Poitiers and just the chaos, because you can see from this picture in the middle, I mean, that's a train platform of people trying to leave France. I mean, or leave Paris. People wanted to get out. They did not want to live under German occupation.
The director of the school, or the owner of the school, owned an estate near Poitiers, which is sort of halfway between Paris and Bordeaux, when the Germans were basically at the doors of Paris, he decided to evacuate the whole school to Poitiers, and we took the train from Paris to Poitiers. It was quite an experience because everybody was fleeing, and the trains were sort of crowded. I mean, there was barely room to stand, and they were slow, but we finally made it.
So like I said, they get to Poitiers. It's really no safer than being in Paris. They go back to Paris, I think after 2 months. And then La Guette and the boarding school were closed, and all the kids that were there got reassigned to other places. My father got sent to a place called La Boule. We're going to listen to him talk about that. It's the winter time, and life was tough there. Let's listen to him talk about La Boule. Just one thing, La Boule is safer only because La Boule is in the unoccupied section of France, and you can see it there on the map on the left.
It was a very harsh winter for us. Food was severely rationed, and the things that were not rationed, just like vegetables, just were not available. Then it was very cold and snowy, lots of snow, very cold in winter, and there wasn't enough coal or wood to heat the place. We had minimal heating in the dining room and in the bedroom and in the classrooms. We had zero heat in the bedrooms, and of course we were constantly hungry. There just wasn't enough to eat. One of the people we were 5 or 6 in each bedroom. One of the people in our room was a very tall and strong guy, and I remember he once went during the day, in the evening rather, into the mountains and into one of the barns, and he stole a 50 kilo bag of oats that were kept there to feed the horses. And he brought it back, and we were eating the oats, which were horse meal. And I remember I had a shoebox, and I filled that with oats, and I kept it under my bed.
Horse meal. I mean, they ate horse meal, right? You did what you had to do to survive. 50 kilograms is 110 pounds, in case you were wondering. My father moved around a lot in France. I've told you about Paris, Poitiers, La Boule. Actually, he moved around. He lived in 10 different places when he was in France. And obviously, I'm not going to take you. We don't have time for me to take you through all of it. But but people that moved around were more likely to survive. And probably the most famous example of that is Anne Frank, right? Who didn't move around, right? She was in one place and unfortunately, got caught. She got given up. By by the end of 1942, there's no more free zone or unoccupied zone in France. Germany occupies all of France. And it's determined that France isn't safe for any of these Jewish kids, and they're going to help them escape to Switzerland. And I'm going to tell you about that in a minute, but before I want to show you this and talk about this for a second so you can understand what was happening in France while my father is there and what he's talking about. I mean, he's talking about eating and harsh winters and classes and all that. While that's going on, the French start arresting Jews. And they just, you're riding your bicycle, someone stops you, they ask you for your ID, you're Jewish, they send you to a place called Drancy, D-R-A-N-C-Y, it's outside of Paris, it's still there, you can visit it. And it was kind of a deportation center to congregate all the Jews in France in one place so they could deport them to the concentration camps. They started deporting Jews to Auschwitz. The first deportation convoy was on March 27th, 1942. And my father is in France then. He's there until October, November of 42. So these 20 deportation convoys happened while he was there living in France. And you can see they all went to Auschwitz, and you can see there were about 20 of them of about 1,000 each. So about 20,000 people were deported while my father was there. So really, my father doesn't talk about any of this, but he was really in hiding in France, right? If he was found out, he would have been arrested and deported. And Auschwitz was not a good place to be deported to. Some people survived, but most did not. So, my father and some friends, their plan is to escape into Switzerland. They get on a train. They head towards Annemasse. Annemasse is in France. It's a border town. It's on the border with Switzerland. It's 6 or 7 miles from Geneva. There are soldiers on the train everywhere checking papers. And when they get to Annemasse, my father said you couldn't get out of the train station without showing your papers. They were met in the train station by someone my father called a guide. He took them to a safe house where they hid out until 2 or 3 in the morning. And then he took them to the border. My father's going to talk about crossing the border and going into Switzerland. But I just want you to think about this train ride to Annemasse. I mean, they had fake papers. Their papers are being checked all the time by German soldiers and French soldiers who were collaborating with the Germans. I mean, it had to be really scary. So let's listen to my father talk about Switzerland.
How we took off our shoes and socks and pulled up our pants, and we got across the barbed wire and that little river, and on the other hand we sat down, we put back our shoes and socks, and at that point then we were already in Switzerland, at the other side of the river of Switzerland. At that point we were caught by a Swiss border guard. As I said, there were 4 of us. He took us to a sort of entry post where we were asked our names and date of birth. We had nothing on us. In other words, no baggage. I mean, just the clothes that we were wearing. We had 0 money, neither French nor Swiss. We had no papers whatsoever. So whatever information we gave them, they had to accept at face value. uh, they asked for our date of birth, and 3 of us were born in 25 or 26, and 1 was born in 1927. And they announced that they would not keep children over the age of 16, and the boss asked one of the border guards to take us back to the border and to ship us back across the border into France. They kept the 4th one, who was born in 1927. He took us back to the border. Turn off a second. So he took us back to the border and he said, this is France across that little river, and you need to go back. Geneva is in this direction, and I don't know what you're going to do when I'm on my way back. So we waited till he had gotten back, and then we headed towards Geneva.
I mean, wow, think about this, if my father and his friends had to go back to France, they had nowhere to go, no place to stay, they had no money. They definitely would have been picked up by the Germans and, I mean, most probably deported to Auschwitz. So this Swiss soldier did an incredible thing. I mean, he saved their lives by basically telling them, just do whatever you want, go to Geneva. And we have names. There were a lot of people during the Holocaust, during the war, that did decent things, that saved a lot of people. We call them upstanders. And this Swiss soldier is a great example of an upstander. Anyway, so now they're in Switzerland. They hike into Geneva. I want to tell you, it's 6-7 miles, and it's not an easy hike. It's the end of the year. It's winter. These are the Swiss Alps. It's cold. It's snowy. It's wet. I mean, this hike, this was not the Sound of Music. Okay, so they get to Geneva. They had the name of a pastor that they knew had helped child refugees. They go to his house. He gives them breakfast. My father said they never knew there was that much food anywhere in the world. And the pastor told him to go to the police station. He gave them money to take the tram and told them which one to take. And then said, when you get to the police station, you tell them that you're 15 years old, which is what they did. Anyway, my father ended up spending the reason they went to the police station, it was a division of the police that actually administered the child refugee program in Switzerland during the war. My father moved around in Switzerland. He was there for about 3 years, and he was in children's homes. This is a letter from one of the children's homes to the police saying that he's here, but he can't do the job. We brought him in as a cook, and he said the letter says that his nerves are so shot from his experience, he's just not able to do the work. But he's a nice kid and he's a smart kid, and we want to keep him, and we're going to cut his salary. And is that okay? And the police wrote back saying, yes, it's okay. Anyway, he moved around. He also lived in 9 or 10 different places in Switzerland. Every time but he's not a citizen, he's a refugee, and there were a lot of restrictions. Every time he wanted to leave town, he had to get permission from the police. If he wanted to spend some money and buy clothes, he had to get permission from the police. I have all these letters from the Swiss archives that he wrote to the police asking for permission for different things. But he was in Switzerland and he's safe. He was not going to be deported. The war ends in 1945. My grandparents, I told you they survived. They got out and they went to England. And so the whole time my father is having this experience in France and Switzerland, my grandparents are living in London. The war ends. You would think my father would go join his parents in England. He didn't. He went to what was then Palestine. It was not yet Israel. It didn't become Israel for 3 years. He worked on a kibbutz for about, which is kind of an agricultural commune. He hated it. And he finally, after he spent about 9 months there, and then reunited with his parents in London in 1946. He spent 2 years in England. He had some different odd jobs. He learned the language. He didn't speak English when he went. And then after 2 years in England in 1948, he came to America. The plan was always to come to America for him and his parents. He said, you know, the streets were paved in gold here. This was the land of opportunity. And my father came first. He came alone to New York City. The top right, this is actually, I know you can't really read it, but trust me, it's the ship manifest from when my father sailed from Liverpool to New York in 1948. And he he got here first, he got an apartment, he got settled, and then his parents came over after that. And the rest is really just kind of a great story. I mean, my father built a great life in America for himself and for his family. He had 2 kids. My brother doesn't have any kids, but I have 2 kids. And then my son just had a baby 2 months ago. And these are just some family pictures. And I'm just going to start at the top left. That's me on the top left at 13 years old, getting ready for my bar mitzvah. The picture in the top middle is my father holding my son. The top right, those are my kids. I think when they're 2 years old, they're twins, by the way. The bottom left is my daughter's graduation from law school. The bottom middle is my son getting married. And the bottom right is my grandson, 2 months old. And so, you know, my father got saved, and there are an additional 5 of us now walking the earth because of him. So the story has, I think, a really happy ending. And for me, I've used that growing up. You know, when things got tough for me, as they get for all of us, I would just think about my father and his story and just really recognize how nothing I ever experienced or could go through compared to what he did. And it kind of gave me strength. So that's all I have. I thank you very much for listening, and we'll take questions now if you have any.
Thank you so much, Ron. We do have some questions, and if you still have others, feel free to use that Q&A button. The first question is, did you know your grandparents, Ron, when you were growing up?
I did. I knew my grandparents. I grew up in New York, and we lived out in the suburbs, and they lived in New York City. And my father used to go every Sunday. He'd drive to his parents for lunch, and I didn't go every Sunday with him, but I went a lot of Sundays. And so, yeah, I knew them well.
Did they talk about their experiences at all, especially your grandfather being in Dachau for a period, or was that not really a point of conversation?
It never came up. I was kind of too young to really start asking about it. And my grandparents did not want my brother and I to know that he was not our biological grandfather. And so I think they were afraid that if they talked about it, that would come up.
I gotcha. Another question, do you know if your dad, when your dad was in France and hiding, was he kind of aware of the broader situation? Was he afraid, or was he mostly focused on the cold, the hunger that you mentioned? Do you know what he was feeling during that time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's hard to get feelings out of my father. He wasn't the most emotional guy. You can probably tell that watching the video clips. I mean, he's great recall, immaculate recall of events. I think he had to have some sense of danger. He had to know that Jews were being picked up and arrested. I don't think he or his friends knew that they were being sent to a place where they were going to be, sent to a gas chamber. I don't think he knew that. But so I think he had some sense of urgency. I think he knew he was in hiding.
Great. We have another question. Besides the Swiss Guard, did your dad talk about any other acts of kindness that he remembered best or spoke of most fondly?
He really didn't, but there was a whole network that actually took care of him. I think I know who the guy was that actually orchestrated all of this through the research that I've done. But he didn't know any of those people because I asked him a similar question. And I think it was by design that he didn't know. They didn't want him to know names. They didn't want him to know the people that were really taking care of him and responsible for his care, because if he got caught, they didn't want him to be able to give anyone up. So he talked about like some teachers being kind and empathic, but I don't think he really had a sense of the big picture of the people who were really responsible for taking care of him.
That makes sense. Another question, did your father ever go back to any of these places he stayed while he was in France?
I don't know if he went back to the exact places. I imagine he did. My father went to Paris all the time on business, so he was in France. I actually, when I was at one of the archives in France and they gave me a bunch of documents, I found a letter that my father had written as a result of his visit to those same archives.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so I had that. But I don't know. He never really talked about going back to those places. I know he went back to Ludwigshafen. I know he showed my mother the building where he lived as a kid and where the jewelry store was, even though it's not like that anymore. But so I don't know. But my father was very willing to go to Germany to buy German cars. He wasn't one of those Americans or American Jews that refused to do that.
Interesting. We have another question from someone who's watching. She says, I'm a teacher in rural Texas. How important do you think it is for us to continue to share stories like your father's with students now?
Well, I'm not the right person to ask. I'm really biased. I mean, I think it's critical. And I'm going to give you some statistics. 1/3 of millennials in America have never heard of the Holocaust. 2/3 of millennials in America have never heard of Auschwitz. I mean, if that doesn't convince you that it's critical to continue telling my father's story and all the stories of survivors, then nothing will. I mean, this was not that long ago. And, the world had never seen a genocide on a scale like this by a sovereign nation. And so, yes, I think it's absolutely critical. And if you want to leave your email address, I will tell you there's actually a very interesting initiative in Texas public education to get this in a curriculum. And there's a professor, Lisa Wong at Texas Tech, who's come up with a very, very creative way to do that. And I can tell you a little bit about it offline if you're interested.
Great. And if you're anywhere near the museum, we also welcome groups for field trips, and we do virtual field trips as well. So lots of ways to connect. Absolutely. We have another question. Do you know why your father went to then Palestine, but later Israel first, instead of reuniting with his parents right away?
Yeah, it really doesn't make any sense, does it? So my father was sort of moved around to different children's homes in Switzerland, but his last job was he worked for this agency. He was shuttling immigration papers back and forth to people in Switzerland that wanted to emigrate to Palestine. And he would bring them the papers and get them to fill it out and sign it. And he said it was really interesting because these people were from Czechoslovakia and Poland and Yugoslavia. And he said they didn't speak French, they didn't speak German. He could barely communicate with them. And but anyway, but that was his job. And then when the war ended, he worked for them for about a year. And the way he told it, he said they brainwashed him to go.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I think he if he had had it to do all over again, he wouldn't have gone. He went, he was on this kibbutz. He said it was very, he said communist Russia didn't compare to the communism in this place, that you couldn't own anything. And his parents sent him these airmail stamps so he could write them letters, airmail. And they said, well, you can't own that. That belongs to the kibbutz. They confiscated it. So he detested it. And I think, like I said, I think if he had it to do all over again, he would have gone right to England after the war.
We have another question. Is your father still alive?
He is not, and we miss him a lot. He died 14 years ago. So, actually Father's Day just this year turned out to be the anniversary of his death. So it was particularly kind of poignant, but yeah, he is not. But he was 81 when he died, and it's never old enough, but he did live a good life.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So first question, so during the war, while your father was in hiding, did he know anything about his parents? Was he able to hear that they had made it to London?
He did know. For most of the time, almost all the time, they were able to write letters to each other. There was mail going back and forth. There was a period of time during the German occupation of France where they couldn't. My grandparents lost track of my father. They didn't know where he was or if he was alive. But then he was able to write letters to them again. And he always knew they had gotten to London and that they were there and that they were safe. So there was mail. There were no phone calls. That just wasn't possible.
Well, last question for you, Ron, then we'll let you go. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to find, because you have so many great photos and documents. Was there something that first inspired you to start looking for that kind of material? And what was that like trying to find all those things?
Well, it's been a labor of love. And I have been through museums and archives in France. I've been to archives in Germany and Switzerland. I think, and I have accumulated some incredible documents that still kind of knock my socks off. But what motivated me to do it was really the work I started doing speaking here at the museum as I started and to help develop this story and this presentation. Some of the researchers at the museum started asking me questions about documents and what do you have? And I realized, I really didn't have much. And then time went on and I realized that, well, I wonder if I could get some things. And one thing led to another. And I started contacting some agencies and someone, well, contact these people. And then they would say, contact these people. And, and then, like I said, one thing led to another. And I sort of got lucky and have found, all these documents. But it was really the questions from the researchers at the museum that really got me thinking about that, because up to that point in time, this was just a story I grew up with, and I really didn't think about it from a more academic perspective. And they really got me thinking about it that way, which I'm very grateful for.
Well, it's an
So
amazing.
support the museum.
Yeah. Thank you for the plug. It's an amazing collection, an amazing story, Ron. We're so grateful for you for sharing it and for helping us reach as many people as we can with it. So thank you again, Ron, for being with us today. For everyone who's watching, we hope you'll join us for future programs in the series, but have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time. Thank you.